Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. A large number of climate academics don't seem to understand basic science. I'm going to be covering that in this video. Late in the 19th century, a Swedish professor named Arrhenius started the global warming scare. He's a distant relative of Greta Thunberg, and her father was named after him. He predicted that carbon dioxide from burning coal would eventually bring Earth's temperature up close to the boiling point of water. Stephen Hawking repeated this theory a couple of years ago. Hawking said that President Trump was going to make Earth like Venus with temperatures over 250 degrees Celsius and raining sulfuric acid. That is some pretty spectacular crazy talk. Now let's look at what has led academics to such irrational thinking. We'll start by going back 540 million years. We don't need theoreticians or climate models to predict what Earth would be like at higher levels of CO2 because we have historical evidence. The greatest explosion of life on Earth occurred 540 million years ago during the Cambrian era when atmospheric carbon dioxide was right at its peak. The gray line in this graph is atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and the blue line is global temperature. Current carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are a little bit over 410 parts per million. But when this huge explosion of life occurred during the Cambrian era 540 million years ago, carbon dioxide levels were almost 7,000 parts per million. In other words, life on Earth prospered when carbon dioxide levels were 17 times higher than they are at present. Corals and shellfish evolved during this period. The oceans did not boil away, and ocean acidification was obviously not a problem either. I've already shown enough evidence to demonstrate that climate alarmists have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. But I'm only 2 minutes into the video and I have a lot more I want to discuss. The original climate scientists were geologists and paleontologists like myself. Oil companies hire geologists and paleontologists because we understand Earth's history. Oil deposits formed in certain types of environments and climates. So oil companies depend on geologists and paleontologists to locate the places in the rock layers where those past environments and climates occurred. It's their expertise in understanding past environments and climates that allows oil companies to deliver their product to billions of people around the world. Recently, however, the term climate science has been hijacked by academics with climate models. And that's why the discourse has become dominated by nonsense from people like Arrhenius and Hawking. Someone told me on Twitter the other day that you can't trust geologists because most of them work for oil companies. This is the sort of inverted thinking which climate alarmists maintain. The very reason that oil companies hire geologists is because geologists do understand the past history of the Earth, as opposed to climate modelers who neither understand the past nor can predict the future. Climate modelers add nothing meaningful to science, but they have completely hijacked the discourse. Now let's look at the actual science. Let's take a closer look at the CO2 versus temperature graph. Note that 440 million years ago there was a sharp decline in temperature with carbon dioxide levels over 4,000 parts per million. In fact, an ice age occurred with CO2 levels 10 times higher than now. Most of the land surface of the Earth was covered with ice at that time. That doesn't sound much like the oceans boiling away. The long-term history of the Earth shows little or no correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and temperature. But one of the things which has confused academics has been the history of the Earth over the past 450,000 years. This data was taken from Antarctic ice cores. The blue line represents temperature and the red line represents carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. As you can see, there's a close correlation between atmospheric temperatures and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Climate scientists have interpreted this as meaning that carbon dioxide levels control temperature, but they have it exactly backwards. What's actually going on is that when Earth's oceans warm, they outgas carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This causes CO2 levels to increase. And when the oceans cool, they absorb carbon dioxide. This causes atmospheric carbon dioxide levels to fall. What climate scientists have done is to put the cart before the horse. Pretty much everyone understands this principle. Warm beer can hold less carbon dioxide than cold beer. Warm beer tends to have lots of carbon dioxide bubbles coming to the surface. as you can see at the top of President Obama's stout. Cold beer tends to be less foamy because more of the carbon dioxide bubbles remain dissolved. This misunderstanding of basic scientific principles by climate scientists has led to this sort of nonsense being published in Nature. 50 million years ago, Antarctica had a tropical climate, which climate scientists of course attributed to higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. At the time, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were about 2.5 times higher than they are now. I highlighted 3 important phrases from the article. Greenhouse world on Antarctica, despite polar darkness, and the response of high-latitude terrestrial ecosystems to increased carbon dioxide forcing. The one I want you to focus on is despite polar darkness. Remember that for 6 months a year, the South Pole does not receive any sunlight. Now let's review what the greenhouse effect is. Sunlight comes down through the Earth's atmosphere and hits the Earth's surface. This warms up the Earth's surface. The warm surface of the Earth then emits infrared radiation. Some of this infrared radiation gets absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Thus the atmosphere warms and we get what is called the greenhouse effect. But in order for a greenhouse to work, you have to have sunlight warming the Earth's surface. Now let's go back to the article from Nature. It says, despite polar darkness. Remember, there's no sunlight at the South Pole for 6 months a year. So the cause of the warmth 50 million years ago in Antarctica couldn't possibly have been because of the greenhouse effect. Without sunlight, the greenhouse effect would be very small. Everyone knows how rapidly temperatures drop after the sun goes down. The sun sets at the South Pole for 6 months a year. That's how come they get temperatures below minus 100 degrees. This article is trying to claim that atmospheric CO2 levels 2.5 times higher than at present cause temperatures in Antarctica to become tropical. These authors have no clue what they're talking about, and this article got through peer review, which also shows us that their peers have no clue what they're talking about either. Now we're going to look at how the science actually works. The greenhouse effect is based on light, both visible and invisible. Light travels in waves, and everyone who's ever been to the ocean is familiar with waves. Some days you go to the beach and the wave energy is very high, and other days the wave energy is very low. Wave energy is determined by 2 factors. One is how tall the waves are, and the other is how frequently the waves arrive. Some days you go to the beach and they have big waves coming in one after another. Other days you go and there's hardly any waves at all. Well, light energy is the same way. Big light waves are very bright, and small light waves are dim. And the frequency which the waves arrive corresponds to color. The visible colors of light are normally described as red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. The way I learned this in school was from the phrase, Richard of York gave battle in vain. There's also lots of other frequencies of light which human eyes can't see. We normally call these on the red end infrared, and on the blue end we call them ultraviolet. Red light is lower frequency and lower energy. Violet light is higher frequency and higher energy. Infrared light is up here, and that's even lower energy than red light. Ultraviolet light is down here, and that's higher energy than violet. All warm objects emit light. Your skin emits infrared light. This infrared light is not visible to a human eye, but it can be seen by an infrared camera. The light coming off your skin is very low energy, both in frequency and in magnitude. However, light coming from the sun is much higher energy. Sunlight is very bright, meaning it has large amplitude waves. Sunlight is also high frequency because it comes off the sun's very hot surface. A lot of the light coming from the sun is in the ultraviolet range, which human eyes can't see, but can give us sunburns. So the greenhouse effect starts with very bright, high-energy sunlight coming down from the sun, striking the Earth's surface and warming it up. Then the warmed Earth's surface emits much lower energy and lower frequency light in the infrared range. The high-energy light coming from the sun passes through Earth's atmosphere very easily. but the lower energy infrared light has a more difficult time passing through the atmosphere. A lot of this lower energy infrared light gets absorbed by greenhouse gas molecules. The two primary greenhouse gases on Earth being water vapor and carbon dioxide. I mentioned that visible light passes through the atmosphere very easily, but there are things we can do to block the passage of light. For example, you can put a window blind or a curtain up in your window to block the passage of visible light into your room. You can also add chemicals to glass which will just block the passage of certain frequencies or colors of light. For example, these rose-colored glasses tend to block blue and green light. They allow red light through more easily, which is why the world looks rosy through rose-colored glasses. Now let's look at how greenhouse gases affect different colors of light. The x-axis of this graph corresponds to different frequencies or colors of light, both visible and invisible. As you can see, about 70 to 75% of the light coming from the sun passes through the atmosphere, but only 15 to 30% of the upgoing infrared light makes it through the atmosphere without getting trapped by greenhouse gases. The blue band here corresponds to colors of infrared light which are able to make it through the atmosphere. However, to the left and right of this blue band, you can see that the graph is white. This is because those colors or frequencies were not able to make it through the atmosphere. They were absorbed by greenhouse gases. Now let's look at the different greenhouse gases and how they impact passage of infrared light. Water vapor is by far the most prevalent greenhouse gas on Earth. The gray areas correspond to colors or frequencies of infrared light which are unable to pass through water vapor. As you can see, water vapor blocks most frequencies of infrared light. The water vapor is opaque to frequencies or colors of light in the range of these gray areas. If we come down to carbon dioxide on the next row, we can see that the colors or frequencies of light which carbon dioxide blocks are much more limited than water vapor. The gray area for carbon dioxide is much smaller than the gray area for water vapor. Now let's go directly up from this main carbon dioxide band and see where it takes us up here. I've marked that with the red line in this graph. And we see something very interesting. The red line is passing through the white area of the top graph. If you remember, the white area means that there's no infrared light coming through in those colors or frequencies. That tells us that the atmosphere is already largely opaque to those colors or frequencies which correspond to carbon dioxide. Now imagine you've got a window blind up in your window which is blocking nearly 100% of the light coming through. Will adding a second window blind make the room any darker? Of course not. And that right there is the fundamental problem with global warming alarmism. Almost all of the light which can be absorbed by carbon dioxide is already being absorbed by greenhouse gases which are currently in the atmosphere. That means that adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere has very little impact on the amount of light which is being blocked by the atmosphere. Thus, you cannot get much more greenhouse effect by adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And another huge problem for climate crisis promoters is that the carbon dioxide colors or frequencies overlap with those of water vapor. That tells us that water vapor is already largely blocking any frequencies or colors of light which would have been trapped by carbon dioxide otherwise. What I'm telling you is not something new. The great scientist Knut Engström figured this out in the year 1901. He did an experiment where he simulated the atmosphere in a high-pressure tube of gas. He then measured the amount of infrared light which passed through the tube. He then reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the tube by a factor of 2 and took the same measurement again. What he found was that there was very little difference in the amount of infrared light passing through the tube. What he correctly inferred from this experiment is that almost all of the infrared light which can be trapped by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is already being trapped, and that adding more carbon dioxide will make very little difference. And he also pointed out a huge problem with Arrhenius' original work. Arrhenius did not recognize that water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is about 40 times more common in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, and it also blocks a much broader range of frequencies of light. Water vapor is far and away the most important greenhouse gas in Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is just a minor component. The Department of Agriculture reported the same thing in the year Bernie Sanders was born. They said in 1941, no probable increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide could materially affect either the amount of insulation reaching the surface or the amount of terrestrial radiation lost to space. And NASA's top climatologists confirmed this again in 1971. The title of the paper was Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide and Aerosols: Effects of Large Increases on Global Climate by S.I. Rasool and Stephen Schneider. The main conclusion of this part of the study is that even an order of magnitude increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by human activities, which at the present rate of input is not expected within the next several thousand years, may not be sufficient to produce a runaway greenhouse effect on Earth. And then they said, it is found that even an increase by a factor of 8 in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is unlikely in the next several thousand years, will produce an increase in the surface temperature of less than 2 degrees. Nothing that I'm saying should be surprising to anyone in the science community. What I'm telling you is basic physics which has been understood by scientists for over 100 years. Climate alarmism is the result of a basic physics error made by one of Greta Thunberg's relatives in the 19th century. Now let's look at what climate models actually show. 10 years ago, I was hired by the National Center for Atmospheric Research to find ways to speed up their radiative transfer model. The radiative transfer model is an essential element of their weather and climate models. It's the part of their models which calculates the greenhouse effect. The model which NCAR uses is the Rapid Radiative Transfer Model from AER. Now I'm going to show you what that model shows us about the greenhouse effect. I did an experiment where I varied 3 greenhouse gases from 10% of their current concentration on the left side up to 1000% of their current concentration on the right side. To do these calculations, I used the standard mid-latitude summer model for the troposphere. Note that the x-axis is a log scale so that I can fit such a wide range of values. The 3 greenhouse gases I used were water vapor in blue, carbon dioxide in red, and methane in yellow. The y-axis shows the amount of downwelling long-wave radiation in watts per meter squared. This is what we call the greenhouse effect. As you can see, varying water vapor has a very large impact on the greenhouse effect. By contrast, varying carbon dioxide has a very small effect. Just as Angstrom demonstrated in 1901, the Department of Agriculture reported in 1941, and Rasool and Schneider confirmed in 1971. And the third gas is methane, which has almost no effect by varying the concentrations of it in the atmosphere. The press is constantly reporting stories about the methane catastrophe in our future, but it's complete nonsense. There's no scientific basis to what they're saying. As I mentioned earlier, I used the mid-latitude summer model. These numbers will vary somewhat during the winter. One thing that's important to know about these radiative transfer models is that very few scientists use them or even know how to use them. The vast majority of people at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change don't know anything about these models, they don't know anything about how they work, and they don't know anything about what they say. Most of the people whom the press call climate scientists have never done any actual research with these radiative transfer models, and their beliefs are based entirely on hearsay. But I have another interesting and important story about this model. NCAR hired me to do this work, but after I'd been working on it for a few weeks in 2009, suddenly they quit talking to me. It wasn't until about a year later that I found out why. I was told a year later that Kevin Trenberth, the chief climate alarmist at NCAR, had lost confidence in the radiative transfer models. So when I saw this ClimateGate email from Trenberth to Michael Mann, suddenly I understood exactly what was going on. Trenberth said, The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. So I was told that Trenber thought the models were broken and that he didn't want to do any more work on them until he had that resolved. The satellite graph from a few years ago showed the lack of warming. So did climate scientists fix their theory? Well, of course not. They simply changed the data. The satellite data from 2016 showed the lack of warming since the year 1998, but they changed it by 2019 to show lots of warming. Climate alarmism started in the 19th century with some very bad science done by one of Greta Thunberg's relatives. And it continues today with peer-reviewed junk science, bad models, and data tampering. And of course, Greta herself. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.